In the autumn of 1945, American soldiers found themselves standing in the ruins of what appeared to be a lumber mill. The buildings were scattered across an isolated plain in northeastern China, their walls scorched and crumbling, their purpose hidden behind bland bureaucratic signs. The soldiers had expected to find evidence of a simple military installation, perhaps a supply depot or a training facility for the Kwantung Army. What they could not have known, what no one outside the highest circles of Japanese military command truly understood, was that they were walking through the remains of the largest biological warfare operation in human history. The lumber mill had never processed a single log. The 10,000 Chinese, Korean, Russian, and Allied prisoners who had passed through its gates were never meant to leave alive. The truth of this plump place would remain buried for decades, hidden beneath layers of official silence, diplomatic convenience, and the cold calculations of a new war against a new enemy. The name that locals whispered with terror, the name that would eventually become synonymous with medical atrocity, meant nothing to those first American investigators. They saw only rubble and ash, the remains of buildings hastily destroyed by retreating Japanese forces. They could not smell the formaldehyde that had soaked into the concrete floors. They could not hear the screams that had echoed through those corridors for more than a decade. They stood in the heart of darkness and saw only the ordinary face of war. This was Unit 7, and its secrets were just beginning to demand their reckoning. The story begins not in the ruins, but in the dreams of one man who believed that science could win wars more efficiently than bullets. Shiro Ishii was 32 years old when he first stood before his superiors in 1924 and made an argument that would shape the next 2 decades of Japanese military strategy. He was brilliant, charismatic, and utterly convinced that biological weapons represented the future of warfare. His eyes burned with the fervor of a true believer as he explained how a single vial of bacteria could accomplish what 1,000 bombs could not. The generals listened because Ishii spoke their language. He spoke of victory, of efficiency, of an empire that would stretch across Asia and beyond. He did not speak of the human cost. That calculation would come later, in quiet laboratories where the screaming never stopped. What Ishii understood, what he exploited with ruthless precision, was that Japan faced an impossible numerical disadvantage against its enemies. China's population dwarfed Japan's. The Western powers possessed industrial capabilities that Japan could never match. But bacteria multiplied endlessly, asking nothing in return but suitable hosts. Plague cared nothing for national boundaries or military strength. Cholera could devastate an army as surely as any artillery barrage. In the twisted logic of total war, Ishii saw not horror, but opportunity. He was not the first to imagine such weapons, but he would become the first to systematically develop them on an industrial scale. And he would do so using methods that even Nazi doctors would have found difficult to contemplate. The facility that would become Unit 731 first took shape in 1932, in the occupied Chinese territory that Japan renamed Manchukuo. It began modestly, a small research station tucked away from prying eyes. But Ishii's ambitions were never modest. He selected a site near the city of Harbin, choosing the location with the care of an architect planning a cathedral. The surrounding plains offered isolation. The nearby railway provided easy transport of materials and, more importantly, of test subjects. The harsh Manchurian winters would serve as a natural laboratory for studying frostbite and cold weather survival. Everything was calculated. Nothing was accidental. The buildings rose from the frozen earth like monuments to a vision that the world had not yet learned to fear. The compound eventually sprawled across 6 square kilometers, a small city dedicated to the study of death. There were administrative buildings and barracks for the thousands of researchers who would cycle through its programs. There were breeding facilities for the rats and fleas that would carry plague across enemy territories. There were prison blocks designed to hold test subjects in conditions that ensured their physical health would be maintained precisely long enough for experiments to yield useful data. And at the center of it all stood the main research complex, a building that prisoners came to know simply as the place from which no one returned. The Japanese called it Zhongma Fortress initially, then renamed it the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. The euphemisms piled atop one another like soil covering a grave. Within those walls, the prisoners had another name. The researchers called them Maruta. The word meant logs, lumber, pieces of wood destined for processing. It was not a cruel joke, but a systematic dehumanization, a linguistic trick that allowed young medical students to see human beings as raw materials. The Maruta were never referred to by name, only by number. They were never spoken of as people, only as subjects. They were logged in, processed, and consumed by experiments that treated their bodies as testing grounds rather than vessels of human souls. This language mattered. It mattered because it allowed ordinary men to do extraordinary evil while maintaining the conviction that they were simply doing their jobs. The first movement of this tragedy was the arrival, the moment when prisoners first understood what awaited them. Most were Chinese civilians, arrested on fabricated charges of espionage or anti-Japanese activities. Some were genuine resistance fighters, captured in the endless guerrilla war that smoldered across occupied China. Others were Korean laborers, Russian soldiers, even a small number of American and British prisoners of war. They came from different nations and spoke different languages, but they shared a common fate. They were transported in covered trucks or sealed railway cars, arriving at the compound with no understanding of where they were or why they had been brought there. One survivor, a Chinese farmer named Wang Daoxin, would later describe the moment of arrival with words that haunted him for the rest of his life. He remembered the gates opening onto a courtyard that seemed almost peaceful in the morning light. He remembered guards who spoke politely, even kindly, as they directed new arrivals toward processing centers. He remembered thinking that perhaps this was merely a labor camp, that he would work and survive and eventually return to his family. It was not the cruelty that shocked him in those first hours, but the normalcy. The buildings looked like hospitals. The staff wore white coats. There were clean beds and regular meals. Only slowly did he understand that the cleanliness, the kindness, the apparent civilization were all part of the trap. They needed their Maruta healthy. Healthy bodies produced better data. The processing was methodical, almost bureaucratic. New arrivals were photographed and fingerprinted. Their medical histories were recorded in meticulous detail. They were examined by doctors who noted their height, weight, blood type, and general health, with the detachment of farmers evaluating livestock. Some prisoners found themselves relieved by this medical attention, mistaking it for genuine care. They did not understand that they were being sorted, categorized, assigned to experiments based on their physical characteristics. A healthy young man might be designated for vivisection studies. A woman of childbearing age might be set aside for reproductive experiments. An older prisoner with respiratory problems might become a test subject for pneumonia research. Everyone had value. No one was wasted. The second movement is the daily existence within those walls, the mounting psychological weight of understanding that each day might be one's last. Prisoners lived in cells that were small, but not uncomfortable. They received regular meals designed to maintain their strength. They were allowed exercise in controlled courtyards, always under the watchful eyes of guards who carried no weapons because none were needed. The facility was designed to prevent escape through architecture rather than violence. High walls, electrified fences, guard towers at every corner. Even if a prisoner somehow reached the perimeter, the surrounding landscape offered no refuge. The Manchurian plain stretched endlessly in every direction, offering no cover, no shelter, no hope. What broke the prisoners was not physical abuse, but the waiting. They watched their fellow inmates disappear and never return. They heard whispers about what happened in the research buildings. They felt the cold fingers of terror every time a guard appeared at their cell door, never knowing if this was the moment their number would be called. Some prisoners tried to maintain hope by convincing themselves that the rumors were exaggerated, that the Japanese surely could not be doing what the whispers suggested. Others retreated into a numb acceptance, their minds protecting themselves by refusing to fully comprehend their situation. A few attempted suicide, preferring to die on their own terms rather than become specimens for study. Most were prevented from succeeding. Their bodies were too valuable to waste on uncontrolled deaths. The experiments themselves defy simple description, not because the details are unclear, but because the human mind recoils from comprehending them. The researchers sought to understand how diseases affected the human body, but they pursued this understanding through methods that previous generations of scientists would have considered unthinkable. They infected prisoners with plague, cholera, anthrax, and typhus, then monitored the progression of disease in careful detail. They documented every symptom, every stage of decline, every moment of suffering with scientific precision. When the disease had run its course, they did not wait for death. They performed what they called surgery, cutting open living bodies to observe the internal damage while organs still functioned. They did not use anesthesia. The pain was considered a variable that might affect the results. It was not the pain that broke them, but the knowledge. The prisoners understood, in their final moments of consciousness, exactly what was being done to them, and when they saw the white-coated figures standing over them with scalpels and notebooks. They felt the cold steel opening their bodies. They heard the calm voices discussing their exposed organs as if commenting on the weather. And they died with that knowledge. Their last thoughts, a terrible clarity about the depths to which human beings could descend while still calling themselves civilized. The doctors returned to their barracks afterward and ate dinner and wrote letters home. Some played cards or discussed the latest news from the war. The Maruta were processed, documented, and disposed of. Then the researchers requested new subjects, and the trucks brought more prisoners, and the cycle continued. The experiments expanded beyond disease to encompass every conceivable form of physical trauma. Researchers wanted to understand how the human body responded to extreme conditions, so they created those conditions with methodical precision. They exposed prisoners to freezing temperatures until limbs turned black with frostbite, then documented the stages of tissue death. They tested the limits of pressure by placing subjects in vacuum chambers and recording how long it took for eyes to pop from their sockets. They studied weapons effects by tying prisoners to stakes and detonating bombs at measured distances, carefully noting the patterns of injury. Each experiment generated data. Each set of data generated papers. Each paper built careers and reputations for men who had forgotten what it meant to see another human being as fully human. One researcher, a young doctor named Yoshio Shinozuka, would spend the rest of his life trying to understand how he had participated in such horrors. He had arrived at Unit 731 as an idealistic medical student, convinced that he was serving his country and advancing the cause of science. He remembered his first day in the laboratory, his hands trembling as he assisted with procedures that violated everything he had been taught about medical ethics. He had wanted to protest, to refuse, to walk away. But he had looked around at his colleagues and seen only calm professionalism. He had convinced himself that what they were doing must somehow be necessary, must somehow be justified by the needs of war. He had taken refuge in the language, calling the prisoners Maruta rather than men, speaking of subjects rather than victims. The words had made it possible. The words had made it almost easy. The quiet human moments were perhaps the most difficult to comprehend. Guards who would later escort prisoners to their deaths sometimes sat with them in the evenings, sharing cigarettes and conversation. Researchers who had just completed vivisections would write tender letters to their wives and children, describing their loneliness and their hopes for a peaceful future. The compound had recreational facilities where staff played sports and watched movies and celebrated holidays with something approaching genuine joy. These men were not monsters in any visible sense. They laughed and wept and loved and feared, just as any human beings do. They had simply learned to partition their minds, to separate their actions within the compound from their understanding of themselves as moral beings. The partition held as long as they remained within the system. For some, it would hold for the rest of their lives. The experiments on pregnant women represented a particular darkness within the larger darkness. Researchers sought to understand how diseases affected fetal development, how infections passed from mother to child, how the reproductive system responded to extreme stress. They selected women who were pregnant or who could be made pregnant through forced impregnation. They infected these women with various pathogens and observed the progression of disease through both mother and fetus. They performed cesarean sections without anesthesia to examine the effects on unborn children. They documented everything with the same careful precision that characterized all of the unit's research. The data would later prove valuable to pharmaceutical companies and public health organizations that claimed not to know its origins. Children were also among the Maruta, though researchers preferred adult subjects for most experiments. The children who arrived at the compound were typically the offspring of women already imprisoned there, born into a world that had already determined their fate. Some were used in nutritional studies, fed controlled diets to observe the effects of various deficiencies. Others were infected with diseases to compare their responses with those of adult subjects. A few became specimens in experiments too grotesque to describe in detail, their small bodies subjected to procedures that the researchers recorded in clinical language, stripped of any acknowledgement of the suffering involved. The children did not understand why they were being hurt. They cried for mothers who could not help them. Their tears were noted in the documentation as potential variables affecting experimental results. The third movement begins with the end of the war and the reckoning that should have followed, but never truly came. In August 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria with overwhelming force. The staff of Unit 731 had been preparing for this moment for months, destroying evidence and evacuating personnel. The remaining prisoners were killed, their bodies cremated to eliminate any trace of the experiments that had been performed on them. The buildings were rigged with explosives and detonated in sequence, reducing years of research to rubble and ash. Shiro Ishii himself escaped to Japan with crates of samples and documentation, the culmination of his life's work, carefully preserved even as the facility that had produced it was erased from existence. What happened next would become one of the most troubling chapters of post-war history. American intelligence officers quickly realized the potential value of Unit 731's research. The Soviet Union was now the enemy, and biological warfare had become a pressing concern for military planners. Ishii and his colleagues possessed knowledge that no American scientist had, knowledge that could only have been obtained through methods that American law explicitly forbade. The decision was made quietly, without public debate or moral consideration. The researchers of Unit 731 would be granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for sharing their data. The war crimes that they had committed would officially never have happened. The deal was kept secret for decades, hidden from the families of victims and from the American public alike. Shiro Ishii lived out his days in comfortable obscurity, dying of throat cancer in 1959 without ever facing justice for his crimes. His colleagues went on to distinguished careers in medicine, academia, and public health. Some founded pharmaceutical companies. Others became respected professors at leading universities. They published papers and received awards, and were celebrated as pioneers of medical research. Their work at Unit 731 was erased from their biographies, a blank space in otherwise illustrious careers. They had been given new lives, purchased with the suffering of thousands who had been deemed too unimportant to remember. The victims had no such resurrection. They remained in the ground where they had been buried, their names forgotten, their suffering unacknowledged. The governments that should have sought justice instead sought advantage, calculating that dead Chinese and Koreans were worth less than living scientific knowledge. The Cold War demanded practical decisions, and practical decisions left no room for the demands of the dead. This was perhaps the final cruelty, the knowledge that even in death, the Maruta would be denied the dignity of recognition. They had been transformed into logs, into numbers, into data points, and in the end, that was all they would remain. Yet truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it is buried. In the 1980s and 90s, survivors and historians began to break the silence that had surrounded Unit 731 for so long. Chinese victims filed lawsuits in Japanese courts, demanding acknowledgement of what had been done to them and their families. Researchers like Shinozuka came forward to testify about their participation, driven by guilt that had grown unbearable over decades of silence. Documents emerged from archives, photographs surfaced, testimonies accumulated. The story that had been so carefully hidden began to enter public consciousness, demanding a response that governments had hoped never to provide. The response, when it came, was incomplete and deeply unsatisfying. The Japanese government has never formally acknowledged the biological warfare experiments of Unit 731, retreating behind claims of insufficient documentation and historical uncertainty. The American government has never fully explained its decision to grant immunity, wrapping the arrangement in classifications that ensure key details may never be known. The survivors and their descendants have received no official apology, no compensation, no formal recognition of the suffering that was inflicted upon them. The world has moved on, as the world always does, leaving behind only the archives and the memories and the questions that refuse to die. The lessons of Unit 731 are not comfortable lessons, and perhaps that is why they remain so poorly understood. They tell us that atrocity is not the work of monsters, but of ordinary people following orders within systems designed to suspend moral judgment. They tell us that science without ethics is not science at all, but merely a sophisticated form of torture dressed in the language of progress. They tell us that justice is not inevitable, that the powerful may escape accountability for their crimes, that the convenient narrative may triumph over the truth for generations. These are not lessons that inspire hope, but they are lessons that demand remembrance. The Maruta are long dead now, their individual stories largely lost to history. We do not know the names of most of those who suffered within those walls. We do not know their dreams or their families or the lives they might have lived if fate had been kinder. We know only that they were human beings, reduced to raw material for experiments that served no purpose beyond the accumulation of data that would later be traded for the immunity of their killers. They deserve to be remembered not as victims alone, but as people who had worth and dignity and meaning that no experiment could erase. Their suffering demands acknowledgement. Their deaths demand at least the small measure of justice that comes from speaking truth. The site where Unit 731 once stood is now a museum, a place of education and remembrance in a country that was once the target of its horrors. Chinese visitors walk through reconstructed buildings and view the artifacts that survived destruction. They read the names of those few victims who could be identified and contemplate the meaning of what happened there. It is not a place of anger or revenge, but of solemn reflection, a space carved out from the ordinary world to remember extraordinary evil. The museum exists because enough people refuse to accept forgetting, because the weight of truth eventually proved heavier than the convenience of silence. It exists as evidence that some stories cannot be buried forever. What remains most troubling is not the cruelty of the past, but its echoes in the present. The logic that enabled Unit 731, the calculation that some lives are worth less than others, the willingness to suspend ethics in the name of necessity. These patterns repeat throughout history. They appear whenever nations convince themselves that their enemies are not fully human, whenever scientists forget that their subjects are living beings, whenever governments decide that convenience outweighs justice. The Maruta were not unique in their suffering. They were simply victims of a particularly extreme expression of tendencies that exist wherever power operates without accountability. Remembering them means remaining vigilant against the conditions that made their fate possible. Shiro Ishii died believing that he had been a patriot, that his work had served a higher cause that justified its methods. The researchers who participated in his experiments largely died without public disgrace, their secrets intact, their guilt private. The systems that protected them continue to operate in modified forms, trading information for immunity, prioritizing strategic advantage over moral principle. Nothing in the story of Unit 731 suggests that humanity has permanently learned its lesson. Everything suggests that the lesson must be learned again and again, in each generation, by each society that faces the temptation to sacrifice ethics on the altar of expedience. The Maruta speak to us across the decades, reminding us what becomes possible when we allow ourselves to forget. In the end, what Unit 731 reveals is not simply a historical atrocity, but a mirror held up to human potential. We are capable of this. Not monsters, not aliens, not creatures from some other world, but human beings with the same capacity for love and creativity and moral reasoning that we celebrate in ourselves. The doctors who performed vivisections had taken oaths to do no harm. The soldiers who guarded prisoners had families waiting for them at home. The administrators who organized the logistics had ordinary concerns about promotions and recognition. They became what they became through incremental steps, each small compromise making the next one easier, until they found themselves participating in crimes that they could never have imagined at the beginning. The lesson is not that some people are evil. The lesson is that almost anyone can become evil, given the right conditions and the wrong choices. The morning sun rises over Harbin now, as it did decades ago, illuminating a city that has grown and changed beyond recognition. The plains that once offered no escape are covered with suburbs and highways. The railway that brought prisoners to their deaths now carries tourists and business people on their ordinary journeys. Life continues as it always does, the present overwhelming the past with its demands and distractions. But the earth remembers. The soil holds traces of ashes that were once human beings. The air carries echoes of suffering that no amount of progress can entirely silence. And the question remains, asked by the dead of the living, a question that each generation must answer for itself. Will you remember? Will you learn? Will you do better than we allowed our captors to do? The story of Unit 731 is not finished. It continues in the archives still being researched, in the testimonies still being gathered, in the justice still being sought. It continues in every classroom where students learn for the first time what human beings proved capable of doing to one another. It continues in every laboratory where researchers face ethical boundaries and must decide whether to cross them. It continues in every government office where decisions are made about which lives matter and which can be sacrificed for strategic gain. The Maruta have no voices of their own anymore, but their story speaks for them, demanding to be heard, refusing to be silenced, insisting that what happened to them should never be allowed to happen again. There are thousands more stories like this one, waiting to be uncovered, waiting to be booled, waiting to be remembered.